Today we will review the URA selection of most representative comparable replacement dwelling for purposes of computing a replacement housing payment form HUD 461, which is one of HUD's required documents for voluntary buyout or acquisition programs that have displaced tenants, therefore triggering URA requirements. A hyperlink to HUD's URA selection of most representative comparable replacement dwelling for purposes of computing a replacement housing payment form can be found on the Texas General Land Office website at recovery.texas.gov. To locate the document, go to the Local Buyout and Acquisition Program page, which is linked below in the description section of this video. Scroll down to the right side checklist section and click on the URA selection of most representative comparable replacement dwelling for purposes of computing a replacement housing payment link. Once you click on the link, you will be directed to the document on HUD's website. Download the document. Please note, you will need a PDF reader or Adobe to view and edit the document. During the initial application process and based upon the temporary relocation needs of the applicant, the subrecipient should proactively identify comparable rental units that are available in the applicant's local community if possible to minimize disruption to the tenant's daily activities. Comparable units are then evaluated using the selection of most representative comparable replacement dwelling form HUD 461 that compares the pre-relocation unit to other comparable units. Several comparable units should be provided for the household to establish the payment limit for the monthly rent and ensure the amount of the rent is necessary and reasonable. To properly assess the temporary housing needs of the program tenants, the subrecipient must work with the tenant to collect all information necessary to establish a household case record for the tenant. The subrecipient must also collect all necessary information on the characteristics and needs of the pre-relocation dwelling to complete the URA selection of most representative comparable replacement dwelling for purposes of computing a replacement housing payment form to determine the number of rooms of furniture that will have to be moved. Comparable replacement dwelling must be decent, safe, and sanitary, be structurally sound, weather-tight, and in good repair, contain a safe electrical wiring system adequate for lighting and other devices, contain a heating system capable of sustaining a healthful temperature of approximately 70 degrees, except in those areas where local climatic conditions do not require such a system, be adequate in size with respect to the number of rooms and area of living space needed to accommodate the household. There shall be a separate, well-lighted and ventilated bathroom that provides privacy to the user and contains a sink, bathtub or shower stall, and a toilet, all in good working order and properly connected to appropriate sources of water and to a sewage drainage system. Contains unobstructed egress to safe, open space at ground level. And, for a displaced person or household with a disability, be free of any barriers which would preclude reasonable ingress, egress, or use of the dwelling due to the household's disabilities. Note: an HQS inspection should be performed on the selected property to determine if it is decent, safe, and sanitary before making a replacement housing payment. A comparable replacement dwelling must also be functionally equivalent to the displacement dwelling, meaning that it performs the same function and provides the same utility. Adequate in size to accommodate the occupants. Persons may never be moved into a new unit which is too small for the family size. In an area not subject to unreasonable adverse environmental conditions. In a location generally not less desirable than the location of the displaced person's dwelling, with respect to public utilities and commercial and public facilities, and reasonably accessible to the person's place of employment. Subrecipients should start communication with the subrecipient before the NOE is sent to determine the needs of the family in terms of a desirable location. On a site that is typical in size for residential development with normal site improvements, including customary landscaping. The site need not include special improvements, such as outbuildings, swimming pools, or greenhouses. Currently on the market and available to the displaced person. comparable replacement dwelling must also be within the financial means of the person. In order to determine if the comparable dwelling is within the financial means of the person, the mortgage or rent should not exceed 30% of the household income. Note: there are statutory and regulatory limits placed on URA replacement housing payments. However, Congress also provided a statutory exemption to these monetary limits, called replacement housing of last resort, in 49 CFR 24-404. Use of the last resort housing provision is required where an owner, occupant, or tenant cannot otherwise be appropriately housed within the monetary limits. This is a common situation in high-cost housing areas or with very low-income tenants who do not live in subsidized housing at the time of displacement. Now, let us begin to review each section of the Selection of Most Representative Comparable Replacement Dwelling Form HUD 461. For this video, we will use an example of a fictional applicant and location to give a sample of how to complete the form. Once opened in Acrobat, you will be able to enter and edit data onto the document. The entire form is completed by the subrecipient. Note: subrecipient will use applicant's current dwelling unit information only, and from that, provide 3 comparable dwelling units for similar likeness. After each and all comparable data is compiled, subrecipient will use this data to determine the most representative comparable dwelling unit that closely resembles the applicant's current dwelling unit and place a check mark under comparable 1, 2, or 3. In Section 1, boxes 1 through 5 are completed by the subrecipient. In the first box, titled Agency, enter the subrecipient name. Then enter the project title. In the household box, enter the name of the head of household to be displaced. Then select whether the displaced household are owners or tenants. In the case number section, include the Tiger identification number that is assigned in Tiger when an application is input into Tiger. The remaining form will be used to make a comparison between 3 separate dwelling units that are closely like the existing tenant's current dwelling unit, such as size, location, and amenities. Form HUD 461 consists of 5 columns: factors, displacement, dwelling, applicant's current unit, and comparable 1, 2, and 3. The first column, factors, lists the different housing characteristics that are important to find a comparable unit for the displaced household. On the second page, there is more information listed with examples of how to describe each housing factor. For example, in the first factor, type of unit, it lists several examples of types of units that could be found, such as detached, row, end row, townhouse, high-rise apartment, mobile home, and to indicate whether this is subsidized housing. The second column is to place the housing characteristics of the displacement dwelling. Subrecipients should input information about applicant's current dwelling unit that was gathered during interview with applicant. As you can see in our example, the applicant's current dwelling is an apartment. They included all of the requested factors, and in the other factors column included another important factor that could affect the ability of the family to find a comparable unit, and that is that they have 1 pit bull, and at their current unit, pit bulls are allowed. Subrecipients will need to use the factors described in the displacement dwelling column to find comparable dwellings. Columns 3 through 5 for comparable number 1, comparable number 2, and comparable number 3 should be used to input the characteristics of the selected comparable dwellings and demonstrate their similarities and differences from the displacement dwelling, and to determine the most representative comparable replacement dwelling. Columns 3 through 5 also include rows to include the date of the inspection and the date the property will be available for move-in. After comparison, subrecipients should check the box of the most representative comparable dwelling. Subrecipients will use the comparable dwellings and most comparable dwelling to complete and send the Notice of Eligibility for URA Relocation Assistance Residential Tenant Letter. See the instructional video on the Notice of Eligibility for URA Relocation Assistance Residential Tenant Form for more information. Section 3 is for comments to the form and process. Subrecipients should be sure to include all appropriate analysis and correlation data to describe how the comparable houses were selected and all details of the calculation of the price of the units and the maximum replacement housing payment. For purchases of homes, if the subrecipient makes adjustments to the asking price for a comparable replacement dwelling to reflect the anticipated sale price, the subrecipient should indicate in the comments the basis for the adjustment. For rental units, subrecipients should indicate utilities included in rent and provide estimates for other utility costs correlating to the housing cost calculation. Subrecipients should indicate the availability of any housing subsidy in the comments section. Also, if one of the dwellings is a condominium or cooperative, subrecipients should indicate required fees. Check yes or no to indicate if the comments were continued on the back of the form. Comments may also be attached as separate pages if necessary. If necessary, the box on page 2 should be checked that yes, the comments were continued on a separate page. Finally, the subrecipient will include the name of the preparer in the Prepared By box and enter the date. Subrecipients do not need to include anything in the Approved By section. We hope you enjoyed this training on the URA selection of most representative comparable replacement dwelling for purposes of computing a replacement housing payment form. If there are any additional questions during the completion of the form, subrecipients should reach out to their General Land Office grant manager. Additional videos covering the other required local buyout and acquisition forms are, or soon will be, available at the same location you are viewing this one.